story of a Super 7. This is the story of how a college project turned into a Lotus Super 7 inspired roadster. This all began in 2008 when my son Brian was attending Wyotech Technical School in Laramie, Wyoming to become an automotive specialist. Training that would come in handy as the project developed. Brian had bought Ron Chapman's book, How to Build Your Own Sports Car, and Keith Tanner's How to Build a Cheap Sports Car. These were step-by-step instructions on how to do this. In Ron Chapman's book, there were plans on how to build the chassis. However, the original chassis plans were very narrow. There was an alternative set of design drawings called a McSorley 400, which added an additional 4 inches to the width. Doesn't sound like much, but it's a big deal in a finished car. So Brian built the chassis as part of his chassis fabrication class. Since no car is complete without a drivetrain, he procured the engine, transmission, and a drivetrain from a 2002 Honda S2000. A car like his mom had before it was wrecked. Very nice setup. The drivetrain came from Canada. The implications of that later on in the story. Now a Lotus Super 7 has a distinctive look, primarily made with aluminum panels, flat windshield, and a squared off look. I wanted something a little different and looked at an Elfin for inspiration. Once Brian had graduated from Wyotech, we hauled the chassis and drivetrain back to Texas. The chassis needed to have suspension fabrication for both front and rear. The front suspension was fabricated using the dimensions from the Chapman book, but incorporating different ball joints and using GM spindles for the front. The Honda S2000 rear suspension was all there and was what I needed to use. Problem, it didn't easily integrate into the existing chassis. Time to remove the back portion of the chassis and fabricate a new frame to accommodate the differential, A-arms, and sway bar. I was able to make a jig from the existing S2000 frame and create a new structure that would be welded into the chassis. A few trial and errors eventually resulted in the S2000 components to be mounted to the chassis. Looking at other designs, I decided to mount the rear coilovers at an angle, incorporating push rods to the A-arms. A decision that would eventually be totally discarded after numerous attempts to make it work. Next was trial fitting the engine and transmission to figure out motor mounts and what modifications would be needed for the drive shaft. Once that was done, it was time to mount the steering rack. I had a Firebird steering rack that was left over from my other builds. Did I mention I had built 5 of the cars? First a Sterling, a Bradley GT2, and 3 Lamborghini replicas. Anyway, Keith Tanner's book showed how to shorten a steering rack, which I did. However, much feedback on the forums said not to do that for safety reasons. Eventually took their advice and replaced it with a Mustang II rack. Next I mocked up a pedal assembly to figure out clearances for the steering column. In the final configuration, I had moved the pedals 3 different times and eliminated the brake booster to have clearance. This took us from 2008 to June 2011. Did not work on car till February of 2015. We designed and built a house during the hiatus, including a 30x40 workshop. The new workshop has all the tools, lifts, compressors, welders, etc. needed to finish the project. Start again. First thing was to disassemble everything and clean the chassis so it could be primed. I had a rotisserie that we used for the Lamborghini, which allowed me to clean, prime, and paint the chassis. At this time, I installed 2 roll bars and a gas tank. I ordered a fiberglass cowl for the front end and a scuttle for the dash. I would eventually sell a scuttle as it would not work with my design. I needed fenders and were able to find some at Tractor Supply. However, they were slightly bigger and I needed to change the radius. The area for the seats was very narrow, only 19 inches wide. This really limited the type of seats that could be fit. I bought 2 dragster racing seats, which fit, but did not like the configuration and eventually sold them and used 2 fiberglass Lamborghini seats, which I extensively modified before upholstery. Time for taillights. Looked for something similar to the Elfin and purchased Chevy Blazer taillights. Since there was no structure, I essentially built a framework around the taillights. Because the front cowl I had ordered was for a standard Super 7 and mine was 4 inches wider, I had to cut it up and stretch it to fit my chassis, which was now painted with chassis black. Time to put a floor in this baby. Made cardboard templates and purchased 2 4x10 sheets of aluminum for the floor pans and interior panels. Lots of drilling, Cleco fasteners, and pop rivets. After doing all the pop rivets with a hand riveter, I invested in an air power rivet gun. Definitely a wise investment. For the body panels, I wanted to do something a little different than to pop rivet aluminum panels. I heard that you could stretch fleece material, like in sweatshirts, over a frame, coat it with resin, and then add fiberglass cloth for strength. I fabricated a frame and added a diagonal rod along the side to add a little different look. Will it run? I shoehorned the engine back in the car and added a 1993 Volvo radiator, installed drive shaft, rear end, and front suspension. I now had the makings of a car. Now I needed to see if it would run after sitting for 8+ years. Electronics. When Brian got the drivetrain, it included the computer and parts of the wiring harness. Found out I needed additional wiring harnesses like the body and instrument harness. One thing about more modern cars, S2000 included, they have what they call an immobilizer system, which means there's a chip in the key that talks to the computer. If they don't match, the engine won't start. I had the computer and bought an S2000 steering column and key, but they don't match. You can have the computer reprogrammed to match the key, but it has to be running. Therein lies the problem. After getting the S2000 service manual and the electronics manual, reading the schematics and much research on different forums, found out all the immobilizer did was turn off the fuel pump. I was able to bypass that, but eventually had to remove a small circuit board on the computer itself to make it run. Hindsight being the wonderful thing that it is, after the fact I found a computer and steering column with matching key on eBay. It would have been a much simpler choice. Now is when Brian's education at Wyotek came into play. He was able to find the various non-computer related issues, and the engine finally started. Ran rough at first and needed to get a couple new injectors. It was now time to fabricate the hood to cover the engine. Needed something to fill in the gap between the front cowl and the firewall. Using some masking tape, I was able to determine that part of the engine stuck above where a normal hood would go. Instead of the traditional cowl being fixed in a separate hood, I wanted to make it all one piece that would lift up. This required making a metal framework, and then using cardboard and fiberglass, I ended up with a one-piece hood that was hinged to the front and could be lifted and held in place by gas shocks. First gas shocks were too long, and the front grille hit the ground when opened. Take 2. Shorter shocks and it no longer hit the ground. I wanted to wait for the heat in the engine to be vented, so I later added 2 new sets of louvers over the engine. Now is a good time to fabricate a grille for the front of the car. Simple round bars to match the opening, then welding in horizontal bars to form the grille. Added some hidden tabs for fastening, and all done. It was now time to look at adding panels to the interior, as well as creating a dash to hold the S2000 instrument cluster. More cardboard for templates, brake press for corners, lots of Cleco fasteners, and of course the air-powered rivet gun. Not everything was riveted. Used small sheet metal screws for those panels that would be removed for access to things like the emergency brake and the fuel pump. Final assembly after upholstery replaced the sheet metal screws with panhead upholstery screws. After moving the pedal assembly for the 3rd time, I needed to reconstruct a cover that would close off the opening between the engine compartment and the interior. Time to play with cardboard again. With the front of the car taking shape, it was time to address the back. Although small, I wanted to have a trunk where I could lock something up while the car was parked. This involved fabricating a metal structure and repeating the fleece fiberglass treatment to form the shape. While the sound of the engine with open header was kind of cool, really needed to look at an exhaust system. Cut off stock exhaust and fabricated new headers into a 3-inch collector. Added flanges, a flexible joint, catalytic converter, mufflers, and 2 O2 sensors. Wrapped with exhaust wrap, and it was good to go. Now back to the fenders. The Tractor Supply fenders were adjusted for the radius, but found out they were about 2 inches too narrow. So they were cut in two, and a different piece was added in. A little body work and we were good to go. The front was a little different. Tried a couple things. First making one using fleece and fiberglass. Didn't turn out well, so that was abandoned. Because the front fenders were mounted to the spindle, I had to fabricate a framework that would turn with the wheel. This involved bending a 3/4 inch tube around a tire to get the shape, slicing it in two, and welding in spacers for the correct width. After that, it was simply a matter of rolling some sheet metal for the correct width to fill in the gap. Also took the time to make some small Nerf bars for the back to act as a bumper. Like they would do me any good if I really got rear-ended, but they look cool. Found some nice small motorcycle headlights that would go nicely along with the small turn signals and mirrors that also had turn signals built in. The fact that this car was from Canada added some challenges, for the lights as Canadian laws requires daytime running lights using low voltage for the high beams, something that took a while to bypass. Another 2 trips to the pick-apart facility and finally found a third brake light that would work. have body pretty much done, but now comes the windshield. Again, trial and error. Did not want the traditional flat piece of glass that are standard on most builds. I looked at various window trims that would hold in the glass if you had a lip on the inside of the window frame. Initially fabricated the lip, made a template for the glass, and elected to use 1/4-inch acrylic. Bottom line, trying to use the molding, heat acrylic to form to the window was a futile effort. Much research and found out acrylic, while durable and scratch resistant, it will shatter. Not a good solution. Decided to go with 1/4-inch Lexan, which will not shatter but scratches very easily. This required removing the initial lip and installing a larger lip, as it was going to actually screw the Lexan to the frame. To do that, I had to cut the windshield frame from the car and devise a method to fasten it back. Oddly enough, Texas inspection process says nothing about DOT glass. Only you have to have a windshield wiper. Was able to procure a piece of green tinted Lexan from a friend, used the template to cut it, drilled and tapped the frame, and secured the Lexan to the frame with countersunk screws. Time to do the interior. Having gotten rid of the aluminum dragster seats, I needed to make some modification to the fiberglass Lamborghini seats. I wanted to have headrests, and the seats were slightly too tall. I cut out a section from the top and added a bracket to accommodate the headrests, which I picked up at the local pick-up parts place. I added a movable seat track to the driver's seat and a fixed bracket for the passenger seat. Working within my 19-inch clearance for the seats, I needed to slightly narrow them to fit once the finished upholstery was in place. A few slices, some clamps and straps with new fiberglass, and the seats were ready to go. A trip to the local upholstery shop got me the foam, upholstery material, thread, screws, glue, carpet, and trunk liner. After many YouTube videos, I embarked upon upholstering my seats. Although I did not have an upholstery sewing machine, I did have an old Singer sewing machine that did the job. I fabricated a glove box and a small storage compartment on the console. Covered the dash and dash cap. Seats were redone at least 3 times during the learning process. Tried making a shifter boot, but found a really nice one on eBay, which was black with yellow thread. Created padded strips to cover the frame between the outside and the interior. Carpeted the floor and used trunk liner on the sides of the center console and interior panels. I even built a trunk with a lock and carpeted the inside. The takeaway. Given the desire to accomplish something, it is possible. I learned from my mistakes, and I made plenty, but the bottom line is I was able to do this with the help of many people, plenty of time, and lots of patience. Hope you enjoyed the story.